Compañeros, welcome to another edition of the SQL Data Partners Podcast. I am Carlos El Chacon, your host, and I am joined by two Microsoft MVPs.
That's true. Wow, we need to start everyone like that.
Mr. Kevin Fiesel.
Hello.
And Mr. Eugene Meininger.
Howdy, howdy.
Who looks like he is getting ready to, redo his hair.
I'm overdue for a haircut. Yes, it's down to my eyes, so I'm overdue.
There we go.
You're about 80% of the way to a proper greaser haircut.
I got to work on the finger snaps for the dance fight on Saturday.
Yeah.
The pack of smokes in your t-shirt rolled up sleeve.
Yeah. I refuse to give myself a haircut ever again, so I need to actually pay someone to do it.
So let me, on the other end of the spectrum, Eugene, just be grateful that you need a haircut.
I was waiting for you to be like, just get old, right? And then the problem solves itself. Yeah.
No, you're in your 30s, right? You
I'm in my 30s. I got time. Yeah.
So yeah, I was receding way before then.
Yeah.
So, anyway, I digress. Our topic today is actually not hairstyles or.
That's next week. Yeah.
Wait, what? That's what I prepped for.
Yeah. Right.
You're getting a sneak peek. So you may have seen. Well, it's been around. I guess it has been talked about, and it recently came back to my attention this week, that SQL Server 2012 is end of life. Here come July, middle of the year, sometime. So we are in January, and we've been doing some upgrades, and it made sense for us to talk a little bit about upgrades today. It's something we haven't talked about. I feel like perhaps nearly enough. Anyway, so that's what we're going to do today. Upgrading your SQL Server, talk through some ideas, maybe some stories, and then we'll go to there. But first, as always, compañeros, we do have a couple of shout outs we want to give. And before we hit record, I was mentioning that I got stage fright because there are a couple of people that I actually know here. And I wanted to make sure I got their last names right. And sometimes I look at the name and I'm like, I know how to say this, but my mind's not quite cooperating because I'm reading. And then I suppose I shouldn't divulge how long it took me to get Eugene's last name correct. So anyway.
Those darn Germans.
Yeah. I digress. So compañero shout outs for this week. Ben Galuso, Dan King down in Tampa. I'm pretty sure that's the right Dan King. Dave Mason, who's also down in Florida. Man, we got a Florida roll here going. Oh, Doug Purnell from Greensboro, North Carolina. Elon, hey, Doug. Rodney Mullins, Jihan Bell, Gigi. Landon Fowler, Jim McCullen, Greg Samuels, David Lacey, Rowley Lee, Doug McClurg, Ricardo Linares, Rick Higas. Rick's in Virginia, in North Carolina, right?
He is, yeah.
Yeah,
pretty close to me. High Point, I believe. Definitely in the Triad area.
There you go. Ron Ware, Michael Fouts, Linda Bill Sinclair, Rob Wagner, Robert Durham, and Marilyn Spittalini. Oh man, I was doing so well there. Sorry, Marilyn. But thanks for tuning in. Thanks for giving us a little love on social media or wherever you're interacting with us. We do appreciate it. It warms our hearts and helps keep us going, as well as do the calendar reminders that pop up and tell us, oh, it's time to do podcasts.
Those do keep us going, yes.
It's the simple things, right? Okay, so we talked about upgrading SQL Server. So we've talked about the SQL Server 2012 end of life. And what was I doing the other day? I had to interact with a SQL 2008 database. And all of a sudden, I can't remember, but the overwhelming feeling of gratitude just washed over me when I think about the leaps and bounds that have been made, even since the beginning of my career. And I'm dating myself a little bit, but when I think back to, some of those initial tools and what was available, holy macaroni!
Right.
It's come a long way. So we in thinking about upgrades, right? So I am taken back to episode 27 with Melody Zacharias.
Yeah.
You had it right pre-show. And
Yeah, that's the funny part.
I know. Well, I started thinking too much, and so we were talking about doing oh gosh.
Upgrades,
testing changes, right? That you can use with the oh gosh, and all of a sudden that specific tool has escaped my mind. So you have to go back and take a peek at it. Distributed replay. Thank you. How you can start testing queries with a distributed replay. And the other one that kind of goes in with the upgrade is actually episode 161. With some obscure person in upstate New York, Andy Levy, talked to us about how to upgrade 8,000 databases, right? 8,000 databases on an instance. So he was kind of
I've never heard of the person, but I have heard of Andy Levy's hat.
Oh, yeah.
I believe it's a parasitic relationship.
That could be. Now the question is
which way?
Who's living off of whom?
It's unclear.
Yes. Now Andy has moved on, so he no longer has to deal with that 8,000. So now it makes me wonder what's happened to 8,000, database instance. It must be lonely. So, but the show must go on, and so we're going to talk a little bit about upgrades. And so, kind of starting into that, we've already talked about end of life, and so I'm curious, right? So I guess I'll when, in your experiences, when do folks start planning upgrades?
When
That's
the
a
current
big old
version is about to be
depends.
deprecated.
Yeah.
That's the answer, and you know it.
There's a big it depends in there.
Yeah.
And you're going to have some customers who will jump immediately. Hey, 2022 CTPs will be coming out one of these days. Let's see what we can do about that.
Right.
And I'm in that boat. I'm looking forward to playing with CTPs when I get my hands on them.
Right.
And you'll have other people who wonder, do I really have to pay for the core-based model?
Sure.
My 2008 R2 is still running. It's still working.
Still got a
Yeah.
heartbeat.
That was a big change for folks, was 2008 R2 and then the move to, core-based licensing. And I think the reticence to upgrade was exacerbated by that, right? Like, I have to hope that it's better now. If you're already on core models, it's like, okay, this isn't as big of a change, hopefully.
Right.
Yeah. What we've seen, my recollection, every once in a while, you'll see somebody post a list of, here are the different versions of SQL Server that we monitor or that we work with, which means you have to take into account the bias of the selection of the population which is using that product is probably not the broader population as a whole.
Right.
Taking that into account, it is still an interesting thing to look at, because typically people who are using these tools, and I know Brent Ozar does his constant care system, right, and posts information on the population of instance versions. And you'll see changes over time where, yes, you are seeing people move mostly to 2016, 2017. There hadn't been that much of a move to 2019, and I think I know reasons why, but you'll see a lot of 2016. You won't see nearly as much 2012, 2014 anymore. So once you do get to the point where, okay,
You
fine,
mean
we
from
paid for
Brent
core-based
stuff, you mean?
licensing.
You mean
What's
for
that?
Brent's reporting, you won't see it?
Yeah. From his customer base.
Gotcha.
Now, I think that's probably also fairly true in general.
Yeah.
That you'll have, once you've decided to bite the bullet and pay for core-based licensing, which a lot of companies did this a decade ago. Some companies did a little bit later. But once you bite that bullet, like, okay, fine, we're paying for this. Now it makes sense. Just continue upgrading. You make this part of SA, software assurance, and just continue upgrading. And then usually be about 1 to 2 versions behind.
Yeah. I think there's another middle ground there, right? Between trying to be on the latest and greatest and, you'll rep 2008 R2 out of my cold dead hands. And that's whatever the vendor supports for third-party software.
Yeah.
Like I've run into quite a bit of that where, it's like, hey, we would love to be on 2019, but our ERP system hasn't approved it. And if we upgrade and there's an issue, they're going to tell us it's our fault, right? Which is frustrating because, like, a lot of times there isn't a huge change between editions, and 2, a lot of times you can just run in an older compatibility mode, right? So yeah, there's always the risk that you're going to run into like something with the cardinality estimator or some change that like totally blows things out of the water. But I mean, that's been rare in my experience.
Sure. How about uncommon? I feel like I'm seeing it more.
Okay.
More, right? And
could be.
And let's go ahead and jump into that, right? So in 2014, one of the things they stopped doing was changing your compatibility level to match the version of SQL Server. So when you restored your database or reattached it or whatever, right, that setting would come over. So if you were 2012 and you're upgrading to 2019, you're going to stay 2012
sure.
By default.
Sure.
And this is, we see this when, so we see this generally two hops down. So these are the ones that like never got upgraded, right? Even from like 2008, right? Now you're trying to go to 2019. Those older versions aren't available. All of a sudden they've upgraded and they're like, hey, wait a second. I thought 2019 was supposed to be better, right? And they're kind of running into issues because the compatibility levels were never updated.
Sure. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, and it's kind of a pain. And so this is a problem. And I mean, there's a million different ways to skin this cat. One of the ways that you may have heard is through using the query tuning assistant, which is different than the query tuning advisor, which is that old, the old piece of software that was a standalone part of, SQL Server install. The query tuning assistant is part of SQL Server Management Studio. And, the spoiler alert is basically it allows you to use query store, you upgrade the database, you run your test through the initial compatibility level. Then you change the compatibility level, you run the same test again.
Right.
And then the query tuning assistant is basically going to query the query store database and figure out, okay, so show me what changed and which queries I need to take a peek at.
Yeah, if you're talking multiple hops, then I can completely see that, right? I meant more like if you're going from like 2012 to 2014 or something small, sure. Again, ignoring like when they made a whole new cardinality estimator or what have you.
Right.
Well, no, yeah, that makes sense.
We see folks because, so there's, I guess I'm saying that there's a little bit of an unintended consequence.
Gotcha.
In that, so now folks aren't updating the compatibility level because my database is upgraded, right? And they don't necessarily see that as part of the upgrade process because it's kind of new, right? It's a new step.
It is something to add to that checklist. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And so, right, this is where, so going back, right, inline functions are still a problem. And then dynamic queries, so dynamic SQL as well, right? So if you're using procedures that have that, which inevitably, particularly if you're, in the wild, I'm going to call it, when I say in the wild, I mean a lot of the homegrown stuff. I won't say that there aren't vendors that have a lot of dynamic queries and stuff in there, but I feel like if they get to a certain level of customer base, right, they're going to have enough problems that are like, okay, we gotta take some of this stuff out, make it a little bit simpler, right? So these are some of the issues that I see when, without taking that into consideration, again, they go to 2019 and they're like, hey, I thought this was supposed to be good. Now, it's also fair to ask, well, what are we upgrading here? Because as I mentioned, right, the feature sets are a lot different. They've also gotten more complicated in some instances. And so now, you have SSAS, SSIS, SSRS, right? So these are the same SKUs, but they're going to have very different upgrade experiences, or can, right? Depending on what it is that you want to do. Now, one good thing that I see with potentially upgrading the SSIS piece, because Visual Studio has also, well, I guess I don't know about the newer versions. Maybe I'll let you guys weigh in, but I still see a lot of Visual Studio 2010 out there. And if, in my mind, when you're upgrading your SSIS, or you're upgrading the database SSIS packages, that's a great time to think about upgrading your Visual Studio version as well. Right now, if you're into 2016, I don't know that I necessarily have as strong opinion, about upgrading. Again, I know in 2019 there are some new features, right, that might be available to you, et cetera, et cetera. But from an SSIS perspective, it might be 6 one half dozen the other.
One thing to keep in mind, though, with Visual Studio is the versions usually are tied to the SQL Server version, especially prior to 2017, meaning that if you have SSIS 2016, you're really going to need Visual Studio 2016. If you upgrade to 2017, 2019, you would upgrade Visual Studio as well. Otherwise, SSIS may not, or data tools may not necessarily deploy appropriate packages to SSIS on your 2017 or 2019 server. The exact details are foggy to me. I don't remember exactly what versions cause problems and when that stops being a problem, but my recollection is SQL Server 2017, Visual Studio 2017, those were the versions where here forward you have cross compatibility between versions, but prior to that, usually you needed the specific version of Visual Studio to work with the specific version of SQL Server.
Yeah, that fits my recollection as well, where like 2016 before, I would have multiple versions of Visual Studio installed if I was supporting multiple versions of SQL Server. And just in my gut, like Carlos talking about, I'm like, I want to be version locked with whatever I'm supporting, and yeah, I do remember them making some strides past that. And thankfully I haven't had to touch Visual Studio since 2017. So that solves that problem.
Hooray. So one of the unintended, well, I don't know if it was unintended necessarily, but one of the unintended consequences of them adding Linux, right, is like, hey, we've got to make this thing, work with more than just that, that version.
Sure.
So,
I mean, that's definitely part of it, but just the fact that I've been knees deep in Power BI since 2016, started transitioning away. So that's been beneficial. Although I'm glad, when we were solving that customer issue with the gateway, I remembered enough about SQL Server to be like, well, why don't we try this? Or, whenever, you were doing some stuff with the query plans and the cache, I actually understood what was going on. So
yeah.
I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, there you go. So yeah, I think if you have some of those older versions, right? Like this is a good time to take a peek. Yeah, I've been happy. I guess in that vein, right? The Visual Studio 2019 has been super nice to work with in that sense, right? I've had good experiences there. I think the big issue that we still see in terms of SSIS, right, are the scripting tasks. Those, if you're going to, I don't want to say you'll never have a problem with anything else, but if you're going to have a problem, that's probably where it's going to be. Right. So again, it kind of gives you an excuse to be like, okay, well, do I still need this, or what's this doing? Is there a better way to do it? Et cetera, et cetera. So SSRS, right, as well, since they've moved that, now it's a separate, so it's still the same SKU, right, but it's a separate install. That migration process is, what's the right word for it? I always feel like there's some variation with every migration I do.
Yep, I actually recently had to do an upgrade of SQL Server 2016 to 2019, and that included reporting services, where with reporting services switching to being a standalone installation, making sure that you get the timing right can be a little challenging, because especially if you have a scale out reporting services where I've got 2016 installed on this scale out cluster, you're probably going to end up with downtime when you upgrade, unless you plan it out a lot more than I did. We had a downtime window, so I'm like, I'm not going to plan this out. I'm just going to go and install these one at a time and make sure that they're working, get them up one at a time, and rebuild that cluster essentially.
Yeah. The biggest issue that I have seen from the migration of reporting services is one, I won't say, well, it's not really an issue, but just remembering your keys, right? Remember the encryption keys. Sure. You got to move those over if you've stored. So really I find this be the biggest issue with subscriptions. I guess, although I suppose your data sources, if your data sources have passwords in them as well, right? And you're not using like the login, right, to pass the data source, then your encryption keys are going to be there. And then because I'm generally doing a new migration, if you can get the same server name, it's less of a problem. But just making sure that the server name, when you move the database over, you have to go in there. It always feels a little bit weird to me that's not that's not a feature or a part, something that you can do in the configuration manager, is be like, hey, you know what? I want to go in and this is what my report server name should be for this instance. That I have to go in and manually issue a delete to SQL Server Management Studio or to the database always just feels a little clunky to me, right? To get the old name out there. But there's all kinds of articles on the interwebs, right? If you have an issue and you can't connect, that's another consideration to take a peek at.
Yep. Now, as a kind of partially related thing, just because this 2016 to 2019 upgrade happened in Azure with virtual machines with SQL Server pre-installed, when you try to upgrade, the instructions are basically go grab the installation media from another VM, spin up a new 2019 VM, grab the folder for installation media, copy it over, and now you'll have it available. What's interesting is the keys that are on a virtual machine that with SQL Server pre-installed are tied to a version of SQL Server.
Right.
But the Azure virtual machine pricing that you pay that includes SQL Server, you're constantly paying for that license, and you can upgrade in place to a newer version. I feel like I'm getting a little bit over my skis by talking licensing stuff, because this is probably going to go sideways pretty fast. But no, what I had found was in my research, please nobody sue me, is that yes, you can upgrade, and the process for upgrading is, well, no, you can't get the key directly. If you do get the key, and I found a way to get the key, I had a blog post about it. If you do get the key, it won't work. You could paste it in, and SQL Server says that's not a valid key for 2019.
Gotcha.
Spin up a new VM, and when you go to install something like reporting services on there, it'll populate the key. You can copy that. You can paste it. Now, I'm okay with doing this because we actually spun up 2 separate VMs, and it gave me the same key both times. So
Interesting.
in that case, I basically said, they're not tying the key to a particular server, a particular virtual machine. So I have no problem if Microsoft licensing audits this, they're still paying the same amount for a 2019 server as they would for a 2016 server. We're still paying for SQL Server as part of that Azure VM cost. So this wasn't hybrid licensing. This wasn't bring your own license. This was pay Microsoft for the privilege of having SQL Server. And it was morally the same as spinning up a new server, installing, restoring the databases to it, renaming all the connection strings, yada, yada, and destroying the old one. It's the same thing. It's still one server.
Got you. Yeah, so you actually gave me that's an interesting scenario for the in-place upgrade, right? Because one of the questions I had was, who's doing in-place upgrades anymore?
Yeah.
Oh, no. So I go the opposite route. Prior to 2016, in-place upgrades were a scary proposition.
Okay.
Things were more liable to break. Post 2016, unless you're working with machine learning services, in which case things break in every version, just install a new version of SQL Server.
Right.
But if you're using the database engine, upgrade in place for 2016 to 2017 or to 2019, that's been pretty solid.
Interesting. Okay, so I'll throw out a couple of caveats. So, and that's probably fair. So maybe, particularly if you're working with, dev instances. So now you already mentioned the machine learning pieces, because there are also some other caveats that I would throw out there as well. Master data services, data quality services, replication, mirroring. Now log shipping, we can kind of talk about that one. That's not but also failover. So if you have a failover cluster or an availability group, right? So again, single server in place upgrades, and you don't have any of those services. I still want to. I
understand why you'd want that, and I'm okay with that personally. If you say, "Hey, just give me a new box," that's fine. Now, replication, log shipping wouldn't be a problem there. The upgrade I did actually used both of those, so really? Yep, no problems there. Mirroring. We're talking about going from 2012, where mirroring was already deprecated and people aren't using mirroring anymore. Wink, wink.
Yes. Thank you. I was going to throw that out. I'm like, okay, part of your upgrade process is to break that mirror and go do something else, right? Yeah.
Basic availability groups.
Yeah.
Which is not quite mirroring, but it feels a lot like it.
Yeah.
So in those cases, with mirroring, the bits are still there. I'm pretty sure nothing's been updated since about 2014 with respect to it. Maybe there have been minor changes around TLS support or something, but technically it's not supposed to be supported anymore.
Right.
A lot of the other stuff that you mentioned, availability groups, actually availability groups is specifically distributed availability groups is a really good way to upgrade with essentially no downtime. Because in that case,
they call those rolling upgrades, though, right?
Yes.
Mm.
Yep. So that's where Carlos gets his brand new server, and that brand new server is running 2019 or will run 2022 or whatever. And as the secondary in a distributed availability group, it gets all of the niceties. It gets all of the data pushed over to it. And when you've said, okay, we're ready, we've got everything prepared to switch over. We can fail over to that new version, and now that's the primary. And if you're using the availability group listener, no code updates.
Yep.
You're using the same connection strings as before. You're just pointing to that new database on the new version.
Right. Now we should say that rollover version has to be, it is 2019, right? That's the first one that was supported. I
believe you are. Yeah.
So you can't go to 2017. I don't think that was the rolling upgrade wasn't supported in 2017. That's a 2019 feature.
I'd have to go back and double check that.
I feel pretty confident about that.
Okay. To be safe, 2019, definitely.
Right.
2017, they did introduce distributed availability groups. That's why I'm thinking maybe. Actually, you know what? Yes, 2017 was supported because that's how we went from 2016 to 2017.
Ta-da. Well, it makes sense with the Linux thing, I guess, because ultimately, right, you have your distributed availability groups there. Yeah. I was thinking there was some catch, though. Now I have to go back and take a peek.
There's always a catch. That monkey's paw is cursed.
Yeah. So was it 2017 that you had to have the same? Now, of course, I just talked about Linux, so obviously that wouldn't be the case. But
nope, wouldn't have the same operating system.
You had to have the same operating system. Yeah.
No. You did not need to have the same operating system for that, because you could have a Linux node as a member of a distributed availability group.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Right.
You couldn't have it in a non-distributed availability group. Because my recollection is that Pacemaker wouldn't support the requirements for availability groups other than the distributed form. But I could be wrong. This is all winging it, folks.
So, related question. Back when I was a DBA, we were a VMware shop, and it was pretty easy to do a VM snapshot, right? If we were doing something in place, it wasn't too hard to be like, all right, take a picture and remember to remove it later so we don't have a 100 gigabyte VM difference file. And when I've done home lab stuff, it hasn't been too terrible to do it in Hyper-V either. So what's the state of play with that these days? Like, I've never heard anyone talk about Azure VMs and doing VM snapshots or rollbacks or any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. No, that's a perfectly viable strategy. I think it is more difficult to do in Azure than ideally I'd like it to be.
Sure.
Azure Backup does allow you to take snapshots of VMs, and as long as you're I'm going to play it safe and say if you stop the SQL Server instance and you take that snapshot, then I have no problems, no questions about consistency, about transactional consistency. If you take that snapshot, yes, it is using the VSS service, so there should be no problems with that.
Sure.
That's also a thing where I trust it as far as I can throw it, which could be totally unfair. But
there could be there's the. I think what we're kind of getting at is just downtime, right? So you take SQL Server off, obviously there's downtime. You could simulate the downtime in terms of like, okay, I'm shutting the application tier off or something, right? SQL Server still technically up, but nothing's really hitting it. Or, we know that, the users have been told, hey, at 5 p.m., right? Everything you enter after 5 p.m. is subject to not being there, kind of a thing.
Yeah,
sure.
I just definitely remember, back in the day, it was really, really nice. Those times where it wasn't super mission critical over the weekend. So you could just block out a weekend for an outage theoretically. And, if something went wrong, you could just roll back and pretend it never happened.
Yeah.
Obviously the ideal is just build it from scratch, right? And you have that same benefit. But for cases where maybe that isn't as convenient, it was nice to be able to have an abort button, right?
Yeah, and you can still do that. You can certainly do it if you're using VMware. You can do it in Azure. You can restore a server from a snapshot. It is not nearly as easy as it is in a tool like vCenter. but it works.
Makes
it's
sense.
doable.
You're kind of going.
Just be sure to research and practice it beforehand because it is not easy.
Yeah, well, especially if you're used to vCenter, right? It's just it's a different way of doing it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can write a script, automate the process, and it is scriptable. So if you're willing to put in the time, if you have the time and you have the need for it, that is a good way of giving one additional level of backup. And for an upgrade like this, it's a very useful level of backup because that's probably the fastest way to get back from an oh no moment.
Right.
Much better than trying to build a new VM from scratch and renaming everything and trying desperately to restore databases and.
Oh yeah. But inevitably, no, I have found that, I mean, maybe this is a little too much CYA, right? But particularly if you have other services. So the engine is fairly straightforward, right? And that is, if you're just doing the engine, that's, I won't say there's never issues, right? But it's, it's pretty solid, right? The trouble is, like, again, some of these other pieces, right? As they've added more layers to it or other services, inevitably, right? Something's going to, be in there and it's like, oops, right? There's this old piece of code, right, that needs this DLL or something, right? And then, and then you need to go back. And so I feel like some of my caution is, well, how well do you feel like you trust your team and that they've been able to do the testing and kind of given the sign off on some of that, right? Again, I mentioned before that we had a migration a couple of weeks ago, right? We were migrating a SQL Server analysis services, and right, we had the thumbs up. Oh yeah, testing is fine. Now, luckily, it wasn't anything major. But then come the Monday we migrate, it's like, oh well, hey, well, what about this? Yes, didn't you test that? Well. Okay, well, yeah. So that I always so I guess the principle or the thought that I have is I always want to give myself a way to get back, right? And the snapshots allow you to do that, but again, that's downtime, probably more downtime than you want, right? And then the users are not happy, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, and on top of that, like in that kind of scenario, like, okay, you're probably doing some like smoke testing on Sunday, but in that scenario, the truth of the matter is like Monday hits, there's a performance issue. And then you're like, all right, we're gonna revert the snapshot. I need you to pretend that all the work you did the first 4 hours of today on Monday didn't happen. Right. Yeah. Which again, like, it's good to have an abort button, but yeah, you're like, all right. I hurt my neck in that ejection. Right, with the parachute and everything. Yeah.
So some other ways, and again, I still think that we should be running it, the data. So in terms of other things that we should be doing prior to the upgrade, well, I guess I mentioned the database migration assistant, right? So formerly the upgrade advisor. So the migration assistant can help make you aware of potential issues. I have found it to be what's the word, verbose. Obviously noisy. There's errors, right? That's one thing, but a lot of it is workable within the upgrade, and it's but again, just kind of giving you some details. But again, in their defense, it's like, well, look, this is something you may need to take a peek at.
Hey, this statement does not end with a semicolon, and in a future version of SQL Server will prevent any statements without semicolons from working.
That dreaded day they just set fire to it all. They listened to one too many Adele song.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's when I get my comeuppance. All those semicolons I've been putting in my code all these years, finally it'll be worth something.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, so that will be an interesting day. I kind of feel like that's one of those things that will that
never gonna
ever
happen.
really happen? Yeah.
No.
Yeah, that's
Put it
like
this way.
good.
Put it this way. They introduced that in SQL Server 2008. That was when they said, in the future, everything's going to need a semicolon.
Yeah.
It's been 12 years. It's not happening.
It's not happening.
Sorry, Eugene, go for it.
Oh no, I was just gonna say that's like a Python 3 scenario, right? Where actually, you know what else? Python 3 was released in December 3rd, 2008, right? So, and how long did it take them to recover from that?
It took a decade.
Yeah, they're only just now recovering from that decision, right? So we're all gonna move to the whatever TDS compliant thing they're doing over in Amazon. I don't remember the name. We'll all move to that for a decade. We'll come back.
I'll put it this way: if Python 4 is a hard fork like from Python 3,
right,
I'm going to Nim instead.
Right.
Forget Python at that point.
Yeah, that'll be interesting.
Oh, it's Babelfish. Babelfish is like the TDS like translator that pretends that Postgres is SQL Server. So we'll all switch to that if they ever implement semicolons.
There we go.
Probably not. I'm full team semicolon.
Full team.
I'll put some extra semicolons in for the rest of you.
Yes, we're so appreciative, Kevin.
Oh man, you're like JavaScript with your silent semicolon introduction, right? You're just adding in extra. It's a feature. Yeah.
Another overlooked piece, and we probably should have started with this. I feel like we've gotten into the weeds, but another potential overlooked component of
we overlooked it.
Yeah, is so grabbing a list of current connections. So this actually did come back to bite us because we thought anyway, right? So trust but verify, right? Oh yeah, this is the only things that connect to this database. Trust but verify. When you then move it, particularly now, again, if you are going to rename the server, this reduces the chance. But inevitably, if there is something that is, if for whatever reason you move to a new name, right, you want to make sure that you know what's connecting, because you turn that old server off and then something starts failing. Ideally, you'd like to know about it before then.
This is a good reason to have upgrade in place.
Yeah, touche, my friend Kevin.
Or to have availability groups and have a listener node.
Yeah, do the listener node. Yeah. Well, in this specific instance, it was actually a data warehouse. So
you can still have an availability group on a data warehouse.
That's fair. You gonna put your data warehouse in the availability group?
Yeah. You may even have it read scale as well.
That's fair.
Spread out some of that query load.
Yeah. So I guess
it's not my money we're spending.
Yeah. That's right. I guess what I was thinking there is that the transactional system would be an availability group. I am pulling the data from the secondary node to create my warehouse. Yeah.
Do that too.
You get an availability group, and you get an availability group.
That's high availability. Should your warehouse be highly available? Probably. People are using it.
That's
if
fair.
People aren't using it, then you don't need a warehouse. So now zero availability is better. You're in this world of like half availability. Yeah, I've got HA, half availability. It's not how it works.
So that's what it stands for, man.
Hardly available. Hopefully available. We have a whole range of HA here.
Oh man, just running actively passive. Yeah.
Man.
Oh, Alan Hurt's ears are burning right now.
Oh yeah, no.
Yeah, I was gonna
He's gonna write an angry letter to.
Be sure to write it to Eugene. I tried to use correct terminology. Any mistakes are Eugene's fault.
Sure. Just send an email to Eugene at SQLDataPartners.com for any feedback about any terminology used during the podcast.
Yeah. So we never knew we had so many options, right? We're coming up with all these great, upgrade options.
Yeah, well, it's a whole suite of HA.
Yeah, that's right. It's a whole suite. You you might as well put all those cores to good use, right? Oh boy. Okay. Well, let's see. I am sure that everyone has their own unique upgrade story that they can tell. Yeah, and let us know, compañeros, right? If you're listening and you've made it this far, right? Congratulations. But let us know your upgrade story if there's something you think we should add or cover or right enhance this story with. Yeah, so I guess last thoughts, last call.
Yes, do upgrade.
Do upgrade, yes.
Yes, and have a checklist and check it twice, because it's just like you said, there's always something different every version, and you just want to have a big checklist you can go through to make sure everything's all right.
Right.
Yep. Practice is why we have lower environments. Make sure that checklist is up to date. Make sure the checklist is working, especially because most of the time we upgrade at 3 a.m. on a weekend, and it's not the best time to be thinking hard about, did I get everything correct? Now, or you could use the distributed availability group route and do that failover in the midday on Tuesday, and nobody's going to notice because it's just working.
There you go. But that does make some assumptions that, you have the distributed group available.
That is true. That is true. You're going to need, again, there's a lot of prep involved. Basically, it's how much effort are you willing to put in? How much do you need to put in? What is your downtime requirement? The stricter things are, the more effort it's going to take, the more money it's going to take. Sure. Whether that money is in paying you to so many hours to do this work, even if you're salaried, there's a cost involved in this. And the question is, how much cost am I willing to put into getting to this point in versus these trade-offs of downtime and likelihood of messing things up?
Yeah. Very good. Okay, compañeros, that will do it for us today. Thanks again for tuning in. And as luck would have it, should you be thinking about upgrading your SQL Server 2012 database, and you're like, man, based on this conversation, I have no interest in attempting to do this by myself, we know some helping hands that would be willing to help you out, right? You can connect with us, and we'd love to help you with that upgrade, right? Ultimately, and we didn't even get into stuff like the DBA tools and
right.
That was some of the other pieces I meant to talk about, but we'll have to say that for another episode. But there are some go faster options, right? So if you don't want to, you want to offload some of that, maybe not perhaps the planning, but at least the implementation pieces, right? We can help you there. So, but if folks want to get in contact with you, Mr. Mr. Eugene, how would they do that?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at SQLgene. And as I already said, you can email me at eugene@sqldatapartners.com.
I think we should just officially make that, right? Any bad things you have to say about the podcast, just, Eugene@sqldatapartners.com. If it's something good, you can send it to Carlos at sqldatapartners.com, right? We'll see who gets more email as a result.
It's funny.
And Mr. Kevin.
So you can actually find my Twitter handle in the registry and software, Microsoft SQL Server, your instance name and setup. It is the digital product ID, but you're going to need to decode that. But you go to my website, which you can get through my Twitter handle, and then you'll be able to get the code necessary to decode it, so you can get my Twitter handle so you can go to my website.
There we go. I think that upgrading SQL Server is a little bit easier. But
probably. So pay Carlos to upgrade your SQL Server. Then you can look in the registry for that key.
There we go. And compañeros, you can reach out to me. I am on LinkedIn. I mentioned my email, carlos@sqldatapartners.com. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm at Carlos L. Chacon. Thanks again for tuning in. I should mention, as well before we sign off. So I believe it's the 10th, and Amanda will correct my dates if I'm wrong, but the 10th, the 2022 seasonal series is going to kick off. We're actually going to do one with Ginger Grant, and we are talking about creating logical databases in Synapse, right? So this is a scenario where you have lots of Excel or flat file data that you'd like to make queryable, but don't necessarily want to pay for all of the costs of a SQL Server, right? So Ginger's going to show us how to make a logical database, right? We get to use a lot of that power, a lot of that oomph for a mere fraction of the cost, and kind of what that looks like. So the benefit there is that now all my SQL Server tooling can access all that Excel data, all that flat file data, and then you can make it available through whatever wherever you need to go from there. So that'll be the 10th. So if you're interested in that, again, registration information should be coming out here shortly if it's not already out, and we'd love to see you then.
Right.
Very good. Thanks again, compañeros, and we'll see you on the SQL trail.
SQL Data Partners.